Behind Hollywood's golden glow lived shadows wide enough to swallow childhood's whole. For every smile blazing under the Klieg lights, a child pressed against a locked door, counting the hours. For every champagne toast and soaring Oscar speech, somewhere quiet, somewhere unseen, a small voice asked the dark, "Why wasn't I enough?" These were not just the casualties of fame. They were sons and daughters born into dynasties they never chose, raised in houses full of everything except the one thing that mattered. And for some, that absence became the wound they spent a lifetime trying to name. In the 1940s, Joan Crawford reigned as Hollywood royalty, immaculate, composed, and relentlessly ambitious. On screen and in fan magazines, she embodied the ideal of sophisticated womanhood. But behind the gilded gates of her Beverly Hills mansion, her adopted daughter Christina experienced a childhood defined not by warmth, but by fear. There were no tender goodnights, no gentle embraces, only rigid rules, unpredictable outbursts, and punishments that could be triggered by something as trivial as finding a wire hanger in the closet. Crawford's obsession with order and public image extended into every corner of home life. When the cameras stopped rolling, the glamorous actress transformed into a controlling, volatile presence. She reportedly forced her children to scrub floors late at night, punished them harshly for minor infractions, and wielded motherhood as an outlet for her deepest frustrations. Christina eventually broke her silence. In 1978, she published Mommy Dearest, a memoir that stunned the American public. The book, and later the film adaptation, revealed that Hollywood's most celebrated mother figure had allegedly subjected her own children to sustained emotional and physical abuse. Crawford, who had died in 1977, never faced public reckoning. She departed the world with her carefully curated legacy largely untouched. Yet history belongs not only to those who craft their image, but also to those who survive them. Christina's account reminded an entire generation that fame and cruelty are not mutually exclusive, and that behind every polished performance, a private truth endures. To millions of Americans, Bing Crosby was more than an entertainer, he was comfort itself. His warm baritone carried families through the darkest years of the Great Depression and World War II, and White Christmas remains the best-selling physical single in recording history. He was by every public measure a beloved national treasure, but inside his home, his sons knew a different man entirely. Gary Crosby, the eldest of his children, later described a childhood governed by fear rather than affection. In his candid memoir and public interviews, Gary recalled a father who enforced discipline with belts and fists, who equated emotional expression with weakness, and who demanded absolute perfection in grades, manners, and conduct. He famously described his father as someone with a heart utterly devoid of warmth, a sharp contrast to the gentle, reassuring voice that had comforted an entire nation. The consequences were devastating. Two of Bing Crosby's sons, Dennis and Lindsay, died by suicide tragedies that cast a long, painful shadow over the family's legacy. Whether those losses were directly connected to their upbringing is something only they could have known. But the pattern Gary described, emotional suppression, physical punishment, and relentless expectations, left wounds that clearly never fully healed. Bing Crosby died in 1977, celebrated the world over. Yet his children's accounts endure as a sobering reminder that public tenderness and private cruelty can inhabit the same man, and that fame, no matter how luminous, cannot substitute for a father's love. Henry Fonda spent decades portraying the conscience of America, the principled everyman standing firm against injustice in films like The Grapes of Wrath and 12 Angry Men. Audiences trusted his face instinctively. It radiated decency, calm, and moral clarity. But for his own children, that face rarely softened into something warmer. Jane and Peter Fonda grew up in the long shadow of a father who was by nearly every personal account emotionally unreachable. He could engage passionately on politics, art, or philosophy, but genuine intimacy, the kind a child desperately needs, remained beyond him. Jane once reflected that her father never once paused to ask how she truly felt, a silence that echoed far louder than any harsh word might have. For Jane, the years became a quiet performance of seeking, achieving, excelling, and striving in hopes that success might finally unlock her father's heart. It never quite did. Peter, too, carried the weight of a distant, withholding presence throughout his formative years. Their mother's tragic suicide in 1950, when both children were young, only deepened the emotional void at the center of family life. In his final years, something in Henry Fonda gradually softened. The walls, so long impenetrable, began to yield, and a measure of reconciliation did emerge before his death in 1982. But the decades of frost had already done their quiet damage. His story carries a particular resonance for those who understand that neglect need not be loud to leave lasting scars. Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from cruelty, but from a father who simply never learned to let his children in. Before the world fell in love with Dorothy Gale, there was Frances Ethel Gum, a small-town girl from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, blessed with a voice that seemed to belong to someone far older and wiser. But the journey from Frances to Judy Garland was not a fairy tale. It was an extraction. Her mother, Ethel Gum, recognized her daughter's gift early and pursued its commercial potential with single-minded determination. Rest, childhood, and emotional well-being were inconveniences to be managed, not needs to be honored. When young Judy was exhausted, she was pushed onto the stage anyway. When she needed to sleep, she was given stimulants. When she needed to calm down, she was given sedatives. This chemical cycle, begun before she reached her teens, would shadow Judy for the rest of her life. By the age of 13, MGM Studios, with Ethel's full cooperation, had placed Judy on a regimen of amphetamines to control her weight and maximize her energy on set. She was a child being treated as a commodity, her body and mind managed like production expenses. Ethel, by most accounts, never appeared troubled by this arrangement. Years later, Garland reflected with quiet devastation that her mother only truly valued her when she was performing a confession that reveals not just personal pain, but an entire industry's willingness to consume the vulnerable in pursuit of profit. Judy Garland died in 1969 at just 47, her health long since broken. The rainbow she sang about so memorably was one she herself never quite reached. In the early 1970s, Ryan O'Neal appeared to have everything Hollywood could offer. His performance in Love Story had made him one of the most sought-after leading men in the industry, handsome, magnetic, and seemingly destined for lasting stardom. Audiences adored him. The cameras loved him. But within his own household, a far more complicated story was unfolding. His daughter, Tatum, made history in 1974, becoming the youngest competitive Oscar winner ever when she claimed Best Supporting Actress for Paper Moon, a film she made alongside her own father. It should have been a defining moment of shared pride. Instead, by Tatum's account, it planted the seeds of rivalry. Rather than celebrating his daughter's extraordinary achievement, Ryan allegedly grew resentful of her spotlight. Tatum later described a father who mocked her, undermined her confidence, and seemed incapable of separating his own ego from his child's success. In her 2004 memoir, A Paper Life, she painted a portrait of neglect, substance abuse within the household, and a profound emotional abandonment that no amount of professional acclaim could compensate for. She wrote plainly that her father simply did not know how to love. The two attempted reconciliation multiple times over the decades, including a brief, painful reunion documented in a 2011 television series. But the wounds accumulated over a lifetime proved difficult, perhaps impossible to fully close. Ryan O'Neal passed away in December 2023. Their story endures as a quiet tragedy, a father and daughter who shared the screen and a surname but never quite found their way to each other. Before the platinum hair and the magazine covers, there was Julia Jean Mildred Frances Turner, a girl from Wallace, Idaho, raised in the turbulent uncertainty of the Great Depression by a mother determined that poverty would not have the final word. Mildred Turner was not a villain by nature. She was a single woman surviving impossible circumstances, and when her daughter's striking beauty began drawing admiring glances, she saw something rare, a genuine way out. But in her urgency to seize that opportunity, she made choices that would cost Lana dearly. By her mid-teens, Lana was being groomed for an industry that had little interest in protecting young women. Mildred escorted her to adult social gatherings, introduced her to powerful men whose intentions were rarely honorable, and positioned her daughter as a product to be marketed rather than a child to be safeguarded. The famous story of Lana being discovered at a Hollywood soda fountain at 15 captures the era's carelessness toward young female talent. Beauty spotted potential monetized childhood disregarded. What followed was a life of considerable glamour and considerable wreckage. 7 marriages, turbulent affairs, and most devastatingly, the 1958 stabbing death of her abusive boyfriend Johnny Stompanato at the hands of her teenage daughter Cheryl, a tragedy that exposed the chaos beneath the polished surface. Lana Turner never stopped performing, but those closest to her understood that behind the luminous exterior lived a woman who had been handed fame before she was ever given the chance to simply grow up. Tippi Hedren arrived in Hollywood like something from a dream, cool, luminous, and possessed of a rare, natural elegance that caught Alfred Hitchcock's attention almost immediately. Her performances in The Birds and Marnie announced a major talent, but Hitchcock's well-documented obsession with his leading lady ultimately derailed her career, leaving Tippi with unfulfilled promise and a complicated relationship with the industry that had briefly elevated her. That frustration, however contained, inevitably shaped the household in which her daughter Melanie Griffith grew up. Tippi's ambitions for Melanie were genuine, but they were also entangled with her own unresolved disappointments. She wanted her daughter to claim the Hollywood success that had been denied her, yet struggled to distinguish between nurturing Melanie's potential and directing it for her own emotional satisfaction. The result was a parenting dynamic that offered proximity to opportunity while providing insufficient protection from its dangers. Most troublingly, Tippi permitted the teenage Melanie, just 14 years old, to spend time in the company of Don Johnson, an adult actor nearly a decade her senior. The two would eventually marry twice, but the initial exposure of a young adolescent to that environment raised serious questions about boundaries and judgment that Tippi later found difficult to adequately address. Melanie Griffith navigated her unconventional upbringing into a genuine acting career, most notably with her acclaimed performance in Working Girl. But she also struggled publicly with addiction and emotional instability patterns consistent with someone who encountered adult complexities long before she possessed the tools to process them. Tippi Hedren maintained throughout her life that her intentions were protective. Perhaps they were, but good intentions, history reminds us, do not always produce safe childhoods. There is something achingly fitting about the fact that Anthony Perkins's most iconic role was a deeply damaged man shaped entirely by a suffocating, loveless upbringing. Norman Bates was fiction, but the emotional landscape Perkins drew upon to inhabit him was entirely painfully real. His father, Osgood Perkins, was a respected Broadway and silent film actor whose professional life commanded far more of his attention than his son ever did. When Osgood died of a heart attack in 1937, Anthony was just 5 years old enough to register the loss, too young to understand it. What he was left with was not merely grief, but the compounded wound of losing a father who had never truly been present even while alive. The silence that followed defined him. Anthony grew into a young man marked by anxiety, repression, and a deep uncertainty about his own identity, qualities that Hollywood recognized and systematically exploited, casting him repeatedly as the nervous outsider, the quietly unraveling loner, the man concealing something shameful the industry profited from wounds it had no interest in helping him heal. Perkins struggled privately with his sexuality for decades, finally marrying photographer Berinthia Berenson in 1973. They had 2 sons, Elvis and Oz. But fatherhood, for a man who had never experienced its warmth firsthand, proved emotionally elusive. His sons have spoken of a father who remained fundamentally unknowable, present in the household, but unreachable in the ways that matter most. Anthony Perkins died of AIDS-related complications in 1992. He left behind a remarkable body of work and two sons navigating their own version of a very old story, the quiet, devastating inheritance of a love that was never properly taught. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. See you in the next one.